In this video, we'll revamp our setting system to be more modular and clean. So it's been about 9 months since the last settings video. I looked at the past settings menu and there was a lot of room for improvement. We'll be making several changes to prepare for the next settings video, and it will look and work a lot better once we get through this. We'll also be covering our text description helpers, our escape menu, and our auto-save functionality in this video too. First thing we'll do is fix up our hierarchy. Let's start with a new game object called Escape Manager. Under this, we'll add 2 canvases, Menu Escape and Menu Settings. Under Menu Escape, we'll create a game object called List Options, and we'll add the vertical layout group component. Under this game object, we'll add several buttons, a resume button, a settings button, and an exit game button. We'll also add a transparent background image as a way to tell the player that they have paused. We'll create a pop-up prefab for when they want to exit the game. We'll have to make a generic. Pop-up 2 will have a panel with a vertical layout component, a default text object, a button game object with 2 buttons as children, accept and decline. It should look like this. Create a new script called Comp Escape Manager. Here we'll have an update that will check if the user enters the escape key. If the menu is not open, then we'll call Open Menu. Open Menu will simply turn on the escape menu. If the menu is already open, we'll first check if any pop-up is open. If there's no pop-up, then we'll either close the settings menu if it's open, or close the escape menu entirely. For the input system, we'll attach the initialize game object script to the player and assign it to a scriptable object for us to use. Now create a script called Comp Escape Menu. In Start, we'll assign the button events. Let's start with the Resume button. All it will do is turn the escape menu off. For the Settings button, we'll simply just open the settings menu. For the Exit Game button, we'll call a function called popup and pass in the string exit. Here, we'll use a switch statement and call handle exit game while passing in the exit game constant. We'll turn on the popup, assign the text, and add the appropriate events to the accept and decline button. If you accept, it'll close the application, and if you decline, it'll just close the pop-up. In the inspector, it should look like this. And when we play, the escape menu should work as intended. Let's move on to menu settings. Make sure you have your title and buttons all laid out. This time though, we'll be making a generic settings menu prefab that will act as our base prefab, including the background image, left and right pages, and the text description. We'll make 4 prefab variants: Video, Game, Interface, and Audio Settings menu. Inside the Video Game Settings menu, implement all the existing toggles, dropdowns, and sliders from our original video settings. Just a reminder that all these settings should originate from a slider, toggle, or dropdown prefab. You will see how this can be useful soon. Create a script called Comp Text Help. Here, we'll simply replace the left side text description with an assigned text. This happens whenever the player scrolls over any of the options listed. Attach this to the settings dropdown prefab as well as the slider and toggle prefab. You'll see all of our existing prefabs now have this script attached. Assign the text to each of them and then just write whatever description you can come up with for each setting. Create a new script called Comp Slider. Here, we'll essentially invoke the slider event whenever the pointer is up. This event is attached to a function that we'll create soon. In addition, all the conversion calculations that we had in settings will be in this script instead. Attach this to the slider in our base slider prefab. Create a new script called comp video settings and add all the previous code from settings into this new script. Make sure to add all the necessary libraries and re-reference each variable in the inspector. We'll make a pop-up timer similar to how we did it in part 1 of this series. We'll just make an image object, make a panel child with a vertical layout component, and create the necessary text and buttons. Drag and drop this in the prefab folder. For now, we'll assign this pop-up to the escape manager and video settings component. You'll also need the accept and revert buttons referenced in the video settings component. Now, we need to navigate between all the menus inside settings. Create a script called comp menu settings. Here, we'll assign a current menu variable depending on which menu is initially active. In this case, we'll have the video settings game object on and leave all the other settings off. In any case, we'll simply assign each button their event, all referencing open menu. In open menu, it will disable the current menu and enable the passed in menu. Attach it to the menu settings and reference it appropriately. Quickly create a close button and reference this as well. Make sure the scroll view has clamped movement and make the content span all the items in the list. The text description should also use the anchor preset that stretches vertically and horizontally. Add the initialized canvas camera to both the escape menu and the settings menu. Remember that this will be used to assign the camera to the canvas. With all that done, your settings should look like this. The description should work, and at least the brightness works. Alright, time for the code to be cleaned up. We'll start with putting everything related to the timer pop-up under the same header. Then we'll get rid of the save button since we'll be automatically saving soon. Now for resolution and display type. We used to use a filter to find resolutions at a fixed refresh rate of 60Hz. This is not optimal. We decided to just list all the resolutions the player can use. We'll also be saving resolution and display type as a drop-down value rather than a width and height or a string. In this case, screen options will be passed in a value rather than a string, and various other changes must be done to address these new accommodations. Comment out the load settings function. We'll use this in the future. Delete the helper functions, and before we move on, rename the brightness and render distance sliders. Now it's time to use those sliders and their corresponding event calls. We'll start with the slider changed function. This basically updates the game settings immediately based on what value is changing. So, say brightness is changing in value. The onValueChanged event will constantly call this function and adjust the brightness accordingly. The value passed in is based on the virtual value given from the slider, so we'll convert it to a usable value for the brightness. ReceiveSliderValue is the function that we'll use for the slider event. Basically, whenever we call the pointerUp function from the slider component, we'll invoke this function with the appropriate slider and values passed in. The value will be saved in a scriptable object and saved immediately. Delete the previous brightness function and correctly assign the onValueChanged event. A lot of our old scripts are still here, so we're either going to comment them all out or adjust them to work with our current code. Most of these will not be needed anymore. However, we may still use the code, so we'll delete them later. Now for a quick test. You can see the video resolution and display type are properly changing in the scriptable object. We'll continue on and do the exact same thing to render distance. Assign the slider event calling the ReceiveSliderValue function. Ensure that the onValueChanged event now properly reflects this change for render distance. Upon testing, we can now see that the render distance and brightness are both reflected on the game components as well as the scriptable object too. Now we must handle our load manager. Create a new script and from load settings file, copy over the code and assign it the appropriate values. We'll essentially attempt to load our settings file, and if the file is not null, then we'll read the data accordingly. Otherwise, we set the scriptable object based on our default scriptable object. We'll then set the resolution and display type based on the scriptable object's values. We'll then copy the load settings function over to the load manager. A lot is going on here, but here's the gist of it. So first off, we're going to reference the post-process profile and set the brightness accordingly. We'll then use the SO game object for the camera and set the render distance. We'll clean up the initialize function and then make a new function called setValues that will essentially convert the actual values to a virtual value for the player to see and understand. This is referenced in the start function. Now, both brightness and render distance should save and load properly. So, for us to load the video settings, we'll need to access the comp video settings component and change the necessary functions to public. It's not good to make scripts dependent on one another. However, I'm going to assume that your first scene that the player ever sees, i.e. the title page, will have the settings menu present. That means this load manager will have a reference to the settings script on the start, and it shouldn't be an issue. I'm also going to get rid of the private cam and post-processor variables because we can just directly get their components instead of caching them. Using getComponent once in a while is okay. Using getComponent constantly on update is not, so this should be fine. Now under the escape manager, we'll save our settings every time they leave the settings menu. After referencing the settings scriptable object, we can test to see that everything should work like before. You can see the settings reflect the product settings and therefore the game itself. We'll also save our settings if they hit the close button. Again, we'll get rid of the cam variable and just get the camera component from the scriptable game object. Make sure to adjust your default settings appropriately. By the way, we could change the saved brightness value and render distance to be the virtual value so it's consistent with how we're saving everything. Everything is based on the drop-down values or toggle states and presumably the value of the slider itself. This is up to you though. I kept it like this so I can see the actual value represented in the corresponding component rather than just guessing from the virtual value. And with that, our refactor is complete. All assets will be shown for the remainder of the video. It should work better now, and at the very least, we covered our text description helpers, our escape menu, and our autosave functionality. Once we're done with everything, we're going to make this escape manager a prefab and hopefully we'll be able to drag and drop this in any scene and it should work as intended. Remember, the load manager, with regards to settings, should only happen once at the very start of the game. We'll need to reference the settings manager at the very start, which shouldn't be an issue. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one.